Website defacement has been around as long as the web itself has been around. And this is a perfect example. A skull is an iconic symbol in many previous instances of website defacement. In this case, it was Tel Aviv University. And as often happens with the defacement, we see not only scary imagery, but the name of the hacker or hackers that hacked it, and some sort of slogan or mission statement. There doesn't always have to be a reason for defacement. Sometimes it is simply that the site is there. In fact, that's a really major point that I make in much of my training. Don't think that just because the site doesn't pose anything of immediately obvious value, that it won't be targeted by attackers. Many of them are very opportunistic. Here's another example, the Westboro Baptist Church. This was targeted by the hacker collective known as Anonymous, inevitably because of differing theological views. So in a case like this, they were specifically targeted. Now obviously in this case of defacement, it's a little bit less sensationalist in terms of imagery, but it certainly sends a very pointed message. Another one from 2014 was via the group known as Lizard Squad, and this was in the wake of the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines MH370. And clearly this is taking advantage of a very tragic situation. The aircraft did disappear into the ocean, and Lizard Squad took the opportunity to deliberately compromise Malaysia Airlines' site and post a message that would obviously be very distressing for those impacted by the incident. Moving over to the subcontinent, LG in Pakistan was hacked. And it's not entirely clear why. The attackers are obviously expressing support for India, so there could perhaps be a geopolitical angle on this, but certainly the messaging is, as messaging often tends to be with hacktivist defacement, somewhat confusing. Be that as it may, it is another example of this sort of defacement attack. Now, all of this begs the question, how is defacement happening? What are the attack vectors that can cause this? Let's go and look at a few common ones. This is not an exhaustive list, but let's look at 4 common ways that websites are defaced. And number 1 is compromised credentials. If an attacker has legitimate FTP credentials, for example, for a particular website, then clearly that gives them a massive head start in actually modifying the contents of the site. Now those credentials can be obtained by many different ways. Phishing attacks, reused in other places where those credentials were obtained from, or simply brute forcing them. And in fact, we'll look at an example of that later on in this module. Cross-site scripting is another one. And I talk extensively about cross-site scripting in courses such as Hack Yourself First, How to Go on the Cyber Offense. Now, cross-site scripting typically occurs in a couple of different common ways. One being reflected cross-site scripting, where the attack exists in the request that the user sends, frequently as a query string. But there's also persistent cross-site scripting, where an attack exists in the database. And that's a great way of mounting a defacement attack, because everybody who comes to the site will see that malicious script impact the design of the site, and then you consequently have defacement. Insufficient sandboxing. I spoke about sandboxing in the last module. The concept of keeping logical processes totally isolated from each other. Insufficient sandboxing could lead to one website being able to modify another. So particularly in a co-tenanted environment, such as shared hosting, this could lead to defacement. And one more, and there are many examples of this causing defacement: DNS hijacking. Now, when we talk about actually changing DNS records, this is no longer about modifying the actual site. It's about pointing those records to another site. And there are many ways of hijacking DNS records. Earlier on in this course, I talked about the social engineering of GoDaddy in order for an attacker to gain control of a domain. That's just one example, but certainly when you can point a host name to a totally different location, website defacement becomes very easy. So there's some good examples of what a defacement looks like and some of the factors that can cause it. Let's now move on and have a look at something a little bit different, and that's HTTP response splitting.